Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming this afternoon to the breakout panel that we've organized for you. I have the great pleasure of sharing the experience of organizing the panel with Ashley Sandoval-Lee from the Bach Center. I'm Maria Flanagan from the Harvard Kennedy School. And ideally, what we're going to do is maximize the amount of time we can hear from some really amazing student panelists or recent student panelists. We have some recent graduates also. So what I want to say is that what we found is that we are rich with the resources of the four people who are here today, and they stand in front of a lot of other people too, who they do this work with. And there's nothing like hearing from the voice of students, not just their own lived experience, but what they're experiencing in the classroom is every bit as important. To how we critically engage in really hard conversations. So it's kind of why we're all here. And I'm going to say that the speaker bios will show you the richness and the great depth of the people we've assembled. There's nothing that can tell you in just a few words what they represent, but they're coming to us from graduate and undergraduate experiences. They're coming to us from different centers, from different programs, from different experiences. And I encourage you, after we're inspired today, please do go read their bios too. So I'm going to ask them to just introduce themselves one at a time, so you can attach a name with a face. And then Ashley and I are going to kind of prompt them with a few juicy questions. And we are going to organize Q&A so that we'll collect some Q&A from you using Poll Everywhere, and then try to crowdsource and collect and address those toward the end. So we're really going to reserve some time for that. So without further ado, let me pass the intro.
Yes, I'm Trudy. I'm a senior at Harvard College in Adams House for those in the college, and I'm a fellow with the Safra Center. I'm a senior fellow for the Intercollegiate Civil Disagreement Program, which is kind of a program that is a mix of a couple schools across the country, and with a mix of institution types. So there's not just other Ivies, but also community colleges and other schools, kind of combined to do this kind of work.
Afternoon, everybody. My name is Tega. I am also a senior at Harvard College, living in Cabot House out in the Quad, so equidistant from here to the river. I study computer science with a secondary in arts, film, and visual studies. And I'm currently an undergraduate pedagogy fellow, have the pleasure of saying that, where a lot of the work that we do is to be able to host workshops and come up with resources for teaching fellow development and help rising kind of emerging teachers to be able to learn better from the student experience.
Hi, all. My name is Cassie Montenegro, a she and Aya pronouns. I am also at Cabot House. I am a senior resident tutor for student support, and also it'll be my first year serving as one of the Safra Ethics Fellows. There are a number of us in each of the houses, and I'm really excited to listen and learn and be in community with you all today.
Hi, everyone. My name is Pratyush. I recently graduated from the Kennedy School, so when it was being referred as to we have recent graduates, they were talking about me. I led the Engaging Across Differences caucus at the Kennedy School. This is a student organization that worked on having a lot of events intended to have dialogue across differences amongst students, staff, and faculty at the Kennedy School. I'm currently working with the CCC initiative, the Candid and Constructive Conversations initiative at HKS, wherein my role is the same, right? But now in an administrative capacity, wherein I design and facilitate events wherein staff, students, and faculty have dialogue across differences. So yeah, that's me.
Hi, everyone. I'm Ashley Sandoval-Lee. I'm the Assistant Director of Equity Inclusion at the Derek Bach Center. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you, panelists, for being able to share your expertise and your experience with us. One of the first questions we wanted to ask you all was, why have you committed to working on this topic? So open dialogue, especially thinking about student experiences while you're spending your time here at Harvard. And maybe, Trudy, will you start us off?
Yeah, so I guess part of this is, concentration is a big thing for undergrads, trying to find what you want to do. And one of the things I actually started out with was I was a full STEM student. My thing in high school was not debate; it was robotics, and I loved it very much. And I came to Harvard and originally started my first concentration was molecular and cellular biology. And I really became interested in all of these health problems and how they impacted society. And of course, this was in part during COVID. And one of the things we learned very quickly during COVID is you can invent all the amazing science that people across this university do, but if you cannot deal with the social side of it, it loses a lot of its impact. And we saw that with vaccine uptake. And so that kind of led me to become first just normal fellow with the civil disagreement program, where we kind of learned to have those conversations and have that dialogue. And since then, I've kind of stuck with it. Now I'm kind of history of science as my concentration, but it's something that has stuck with me. The idea that having these conversations can really support a lot of the other work we do in other sectors and other places across the university.
Yeah, so my reasons are numerous, and I'll say immediately off the bat, especially as an undergrad, there's a very common discourse about imposter syndrome. And I would say, as many of you may probably be aware, I would say that was one of the things that kind of plagued me coming into the school. And I know that that's a conversation that a lot of students can have, but are not necessarily aware of how to navigate, irrespective. But I think one thing that sort of drives imposter syndrome and sort of could also tackle it head on is the realization that Harvard as a whole is the people that compose it. And it's more towards necessarily the students don't need Harvard, but Harvard needs its students. And being able to empower the students in this way is something that I've committed to with my work at the Bach Center, being able to recognize different experiences and to accommodate that for students, and to make sure that that teachers, faculty, TFs, a lot of people are able to orient themselves in ways to empower students as well to overcome things like imposter syndrome.
Your response really touched me, both of you, because you both, I don't know you too well personally, but I think I'm here because I didn't have a lot of outlets to engage with my own imposter syndrome when I was in college. It took years for me to work through that, and I still work through it in this work here. But I'm here to learn from peers, from students, and from mentors who've been doing this work for a long time and brought me into good space. I'm nodding because some of the restorative justice circles that I've had the opportunity to be in with Ashley. And I will say I'm a recent grad from the Divinity School, and I have a background in law and teaching. And what brought me here was to have these deeper ethical, for some folks, they consider it spiritual or religious conversations, and to create space for one another to tap in deeper than what we might otherwise deem appropriate in a standard academic space, whatever that might mean to each of us, or institutionally or cross institutions.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, and thank you for that wonderful question. I am here because I was always very curious about hate and polarization from the beginning. I belong to a family that migrated during the partition of India. So my grandparents found themselves in Pakistan when India was partitioned, and they had to come to India. And I grew up listening to their stories of partition and how it was an incident of hate, and just people could not talk to each other, have dialogue, and ultimately the country was divided and people were uprooted from their ancestral places and villages. And that, I grew up with those stories, and India is such a diverse country, and there was a lot of polarization recently. So I started my own NGO in India. It's called Sadbhavna, and we work on countering hate and polarization through dialogue. So when I saw a lot of tense, uh, environment in HKS. And I also found a co-pilot, a Pakistani. He's a friend, and we're still working with the CCC. We designed a lot of events and interventions and invited students to come and participate. And it was just very natural to be interested in dialogue and to create bridges instead of creating walls, and to listen to the other side and understanding what they're going through. And a lot of research at the Kennedy School also supported the work that we did. So that's how it was very natural. Thank you.
Thank you all for sharing a bit about what brought you to this very moment. And I was noticing a through line through all of your motivations for this work or your own personal experiences. And so I'm wondering, how do you bring your personal experiences into challenging conversations or into workshops that you give about student experiences? What are your sort of methods for doing that? And maybe Cassie, would you want to start us off?
Sure. I would say that, I'll just say last night I was in a resident tutor meeting and I was engaging in a topic with another tutor in front of the tutors. And it was a question of ethics and how to engage with it, something that had come up in the house. And I could feel my own reactivity and my own personal take on the situation. And quite frankly, I didn't take a moment to reground myself. I didn't. I just went straight in. Part of me being human and being human in, I think, based off of some of the earlier training that I've had, to be quite adversarial in many ways. And then in that moment, there was an openness, I think, in the group and in my peer to then allowed me, and maybe some of the other work that frankly, I think has been modeled for me, to be vulnerable and to say, you know what, actually, let me course correct right there. I was really reactive. That was my personal reaction to something that's been on my heart, that's been on some of my students' hearts and lived experiences throughout their time here at the university. So I took a step back and then I say grounded, recentered my body, took a breath, and then asked the question that I would have actually wanted to answer. And I believe I would have answered if I would have been kind of in that role as a student versus I'm there with peers. But wait a second, peers are in part of my community as well. Why can't I incorporate some of this tenderness and vulnerability with folks as well? So I think it really does begin with, frankly, checking oneself in the moment and being willing to open oneself up to disagreement, even if it's internal disagreement. I can be wrong.
That's wonderful, Cassie. And I have a similar story. But this is a couple of years ago. I used to have very hot agreements with my father. He's a Modi supporter. I'm not. And I was living in Delhi, and my hometown is around 6 hours from Delhi. I used to come down almost every weekend, shout him down, present him with facts, and then go back. And then COVID happened. And I came and I lived at my place, and I saw the information that he was consuming, what was on his WhatsApp groups, what was on his news feed. And I realized that whatever he was doing is very human. It is so human for anyone to believe what they believe in. And I also wrote an article at that point of time that if hate is a virus, and if you're constantly spraying that virus on someone else, how do you expect someone to be super immune to that? You cannot. It is very human. So, and I started talking to him. I started showing him TV series that were about progressive individuals and progressive characters. I started showing him alternative news, and we started having good discussions. He became curious because the other was projected to him in a really evil manner. That was the propaganda that he was feeding on. and it was not his mistakes. And I also started listening and becoming more curious about where was he coming from. He was not coming from a place of hate. He was coming from a place of protecting our community, whatever he was interpreting it. And now, and then when I came to HKS, I realized that there has been research that says that you cannot change someone's opinion without him or her or them feeling heard. I think all of us liberals are looking for that one wonderful speech that you would say and the other person would completely transform. No, that is never going to happen. We're going to have to create space, give space, and take space sometimes for others to vent whatever they're sharing. And yeah, so that is the kind of experiences that I try to create in my work. Let's create spaces for listening. Let's ask good questions. Let's not share facts, but uh, our stories and our narratives. And that is what transforms and builds bridges. Yeah.
Yeah, those are some absolutely wonderful insights. And I am also very resonant, especially about the point of, you know, taking a step back. I think for me personally, one of the things that I genuinely believe is that lived experiences aren't exclusive to classrooms. I believe the conversation can begin in a classroom, but it will never end in a classroom, especially because people's lived experiences are constantly changing. They're constantly evolving, and they are a product of the world around them and not just things they hear in a classroom or what they learn or what they say. And I'd say personally, one of the ways that I try and um, make my lived experience known in a classroom is by also being vulnerable, especially in a lot of situations when I share my failures. I share when I've pursued something that I was genuinely interested in, exactly why it didn't work and what didn't work. And um, people can take that as they want. They can provide feedback in any sort of way, but it opens the conversation to begin with. And it teaches somebody else about my lived experience in the sense of um, what I've gone through, and maybe they can learn uh, how they may not have to experience it, especially in academic settings. I will say, I do aspire to be part of more classroom settings where we're able to talk about more complex issues and challenging conversations, especially having a CS background. I will say one of the more CS related ways that I've kind of exerted my failure is just being taught by other students when I don't understand a topic, and I'm completely okay with that. But sometimes that's just necessary, and that's what it takes.
Um, when I think about some of these like lived experiences and challenging conversations, one, I'm speaking with like other fellows, like especially the newer fellows with ICDP, which is a separate program. I think a little bit more about how I felt way in like the first classroom experiences, like kindergarten and first grade. And so my parents are both immigrants to the US. And so obviously there are cultural things that come with that. And oftentimes, just in the area I lived, the first school I went to was a less diverse school. It's a majority white school. And it was very different because you would see there would be cultural differences, questions, and stuff like that. But as a young, like kindergartner, it doesn't feel discriminatory or hurtful because they don't know, but they don't know anything. We don't know anything. We're all kindergartners. We're all learning stuff. And so in that environment, things do feel less and less hurtful. And because they're not meant to be hurtful. Again, kindergartners, they don't know anything about your country. They don't barely know what country they live in right now. And so and we lose that obviously when we grow older and we expect everybody to know everything about ourselves. And sometimes we do feel hurt and harmed when people don't really feel and know the things that we feel that they should know about us and our culture. And it causes conflict. But I think one of the things I always think about when leading or guiding these conversations is that people do not know everything you know about yourself. They did not go through your experiences, and you have to assume best intentions. You have to give them that grace and think they did not have those formative experiences, and you grew up in different worlds. We all grew up in different worlds from each other at a school this big and this diverse.
Thank you all for sharing a bit about your experiences and how you navigate these conversations. I'm just going to take a brief moment to remind folks, too, that we have a poll everywhere. Link here, a QR code. So if folks want to ask questions and put that on there, or upvote questions, please feel free to do that. Maria will be facilitating our Q&A in just a second. But before we do that, going back to your experiences, have you noticed among your experiences certain strategies or approaches that you felt were really effective at fostering respectful and inclusive conversations around controversial or complex topics? And thinking about that, how have those approaches worked when maybe people's lived experiences contradicted each other or in conflict? How can students hold space for multiple student experiences at the same time? Judy, would you like to start us off?
Sure. Yeah. So I mean, the great thing about ICDP is it is all approaches. We have so many names for our approaches, and I'm going to spare you guys any more specialized terms than you already deal with in your day-to-day jobs. But one of the big things we found that has been very, very helpful is asking people to state the goal of what they want their conversation to be and know that, even if they don't say it out loud, and B, to make sure that they're asking questions that get to that goal. So, if you're in a courtroom, for example, you're going to have a very different conversation than if you're in a dining hall. But sometimes you don't if you don't know that that's the kind of conversation you're trying to have. Not every conversation is meant to be won or meant to be lost. Some of it is just meant to learn and to grow and to discuss, and some just to pass the time. And I think if that is the conversation you're having, you need to change your questions. And I think we call them dialogic questions. So I guess it will give you one specialized term. But essentially, it's just make sure that your questions are actually a question. So it's not, why are you terrible? But it's, why do you feel this way? What experiences made you to come to this conclusion? Why the 5 W's or whatever we learned earlier on? It's like all these things that we somehow learned as kids but seemingly forgot. Some of those concepts end up getting come back, renamed, obviously advanced, but it's the same root core that you're coming to learn and you're coming to discuss meaningfully. And if you want to have a conversation like that, you do need to change your approach from the way that many of us do have the conversations, because much more frequently when it comes to these contentious topics, we hear questions like, why do you read this stupid news source? Why do you not know this? Why do you not care about my identity? Right? And you don't hear the question of, why is this important to you? Why is this a deep value that you hold? And I think it's really a very simple, I guess, maybe answer to this question for me, is that make sure that we are asking the questions that actually draw out what we want to know in the context of the conversation, and not the questions that are meant for the theater of the debate that many of us felt like we should just win here.
Yeah, this is, I'd say, one of the most practical things, I would say, for these types of conversations that I've experienced, is that not everything has to be academic. When we're having these conversations, not everything needs to be research-based. Not everything needs to be a understanding goal. Not everything needs to be you get the idea. I could go on. But at the end of the day, people's experiences are not always covered by academia and not always represented by academia. And that is a very subtle way that they can just be invalidated sometimes, especially if they're not covered in academia. You don't have facts, you don't have research-based evidence, you don't bring more, kind of rigorous topics, then you don't have a place in this conversation. It might not necessarily be said by this, but these are some of the sentiments and some of the notions that can reinforce imposter syndrome among students, especially that I've witnessed. And the ultimate goal of a conversation like Judy alluded to, is to be able to, well, it should be established, but it's to hear from other perspectives. It's for them to be heard. In situations where people disagree, in situations where people contradict one another, those situations often can be the times where the most questions are asked and the most information is able to be shared that differ without invalidating one another. And I, for example, have a friend. When we have conversations like this, I don't think I would have ever learned this otherwise, but I have a friend, he's from an Eastern European country, and he talks about his Thracian heritage, which I had no idea about at all going into the school. And there are a lot of these things where you don't know what you don't know, and academia might not necessarily be able to cover that all the time. Of course, that is the part of it. That is where learning comes. That is what academia is. But the lived experiences of individuals that can't just be covered by classrooms or can't just be covered by assigned readings are things that they go much more beyond just academia and college. So it's very important that learning about people, as I mentioned, it's not always going to be a research paper. Yeah.
So the kind of strategies that we use when we organize dialogue spaces are start with the norms, very clearly state the norms that speak from the I, choose curiosity over judgment, ask good questions. Sometimes in these spaces, I also state this ancient Indian story of 5 blind men looking at the elephant. One touches the feet and thinks that it's a pillar. One touches the tail and thinks that this is like a snake. One touches the tusk and thinks that the elephant is like a spear. And to just convey that there are multiple truths, and we're like those 5 blind men. We do not know the complete truth. The maximum that we can do is go to someone else's position and understand what truth they are seeing, because it is beyond us to look at the truth. And that that initiates this space with some sort of a humility, which is really helpful in these conversations. I think one of the things that we at CCC are also doing is framing these spaces as skill building spaces, as aspirational spaces, that these can be spaces wherein you can ask good questions. These can be spaces wherein you can learn how to engage with the other. That is one thing, one of the other strategies that we're doing. The final one is food and music. I cannot overstate how food and music brings people together, and also students for free food. But just create spaces wherein there is food, because people get angry when they're hungry. And I'm also me and my friend, we're also playing with the idea of playing some calm piano music while these events are happening, so as it just lowers down the temper and lowers down the tension. So these are some background strategies, but they usually work in making sure that the conversations are, people lower down their guards and people are more vulnerable and people are more free in sharing where they're coming from. Yeah.
Thank you. As I'm sitting with each of your responses, I think what came to me was this question of, am I ready to show up for the answer to that question that I might not like? Are there certain parts of myself that are still in, let's say, debate versus maybe some other end that I hope to name? So, and I think I learned this from Dean Melissa Bartholomew at the Divinity School. Reverend Dr. Bartholomew worked closely with me. My first year, it was virtual, and she worked closely with a group that I was part of, and there was some disagreement. And she asked me if I was ready to receive the feedback, because it might not be the feedback or the answer or that I might be looking for. She's done a lot of work over the years. She's a very intuitive and skilled educator. And she was right. I needed some time. And it was a reality check that me, in my very excited newness of being a diff school student, trying to do all these lofty things in a difficult time and also see my grandmother amidst, quarantine. Yeah, I really appreciate her allowing me. I guess it does go back to that pause and that personal, some call it a gut check, an honest gut check of not who am I supposed to be in response to this or thinking about what the different responses could be, but where am I actually right now? Where are parts of me right now? And do I need to do something with myself, with my body, with my senses to be more open to the fact that parts of me might not like the answers that other folks are giving?
Thank you. Thank you all for sharing your own best practices and strategies for navigating these conversations. Maria, do I have time to ask one more question?
Yes, I think our the final question matches really well with some of the ones that have been rolling in on Poll Everywhere. So I'm not checking my WhatsApp group. I'm looking at the poll questions coming in. And so I think let's go right to it. And this last one, we had sort of thought the responses might be short, but I think the practicality of the question will kind of be very of great interest to the people. So
Yeah, great.
we'll extend our answer time.
Okay, sounds good. So our last question for folks is if you could give faculty and instructors one piece of advice for how to facilitate challenging conversations in the classroom that incorporate students' lived experiences, what would that advice be? Pratush, do you want to?
I don't know. I come from a culture wherein you cannot advise teachers, so it's a so it's a little difficult. But I'm thinking of Professor Dan Levy. He was teaching this course, Thinking Analytically, in Harvard Kennedy School when October 7th happened, and his class was a couple of days right after it happened. And he stood in the class. We observed 2 minutes of silence, and then he said that, "Hey, I'm the professor here. You are the students. This would not be a dialogue. This is not the because I would be speaking from a position of relatively more power than you, but I would want to hear from what you're saying. So this is probably not the right platform to engage into these discussions. Come to office hours. I have a lot to share and a lot to talk about, but I want to hear from you, and that's why this is not the right platform." And I found that approach, that if not that approach, that acknowledgement or that awareness really, really powerful for a professor to say that, I understand what platforms work for those discussions and what platforms do not. But at the same time, there have been professors like Professor Tariq Masood, and I've not attended his classes, but they've been able to hold spaces wherein these difficult conversations have taken place. Professor Tim McCarthy from Hugsy, I spoke to him very recently, and he told me that he was one of the very few professors that all parties would want to interact with. So, I mean, you just project yourself as someone who's available, open to listening, and I think that is all that matters for students. So yeah.
I will say, I'm sure there'll be a lot of detailed talk about facilitation, and I'm sure somebody's published a guide on that somewhere. I will say for professors, before you even get to the point of the conversation, like of facilitating the conversation or managing and navigating it, make sure you've picked a meaningful topic, I will say, because you will sometimes see a lot of professors unintentionally they will have a dialogue. And if your dialogue at Harvard College, for example, is climate change real, you haven't really started a controversial dialogue. You've started a dialogue where 95% of people agree with you and the 5% who don't agree will not talk. And I think making sure we're picking topics correctly. I mean, depending on the course, if it's depending on the course and the students, you wouldn't pick certain topics, for example, like Israel Palestine and some of these other really highly controversial topics, because if you don't frame it in the precisely correct way, you may end up creating a scenario where you've pushed the majority of the class out, and on the only people talking are the people who have like a strong opinion, a strong vested interest, and you've excluded most people from the conversation from the point of framing. So I'll say being very careful about how we frame conversations, what we pick as a topic, even within a topic. No topic is fully off limits, but making sure you're framing the conversation correctly in a way that everyone feels that they have a path into the conversation, I think is really important. And also making sure we're not just hyping ourselves up to say we had a controversial conversation about, something that nobody in this room actually disagrees on.
One way I would definitely suggest navigating this for professors is actually setting the example to begin with. And the reason I say that is because a lot of students, of course, highly respect professors. They're highly revered. They have a lot of credentials in their career, and there's a lot that's taken them to get to the point where they got to. That being said, if even in situations where the professor is able to open up themselves and is able to contribute from their perspective to a conversation, not necessarily in a way to encourage certain things to be said, but more to acknowledge what got them to where they were and how that relates to the subject matter. That will essentially vanquish this barrier, this boundary that students will feel with the professors to begin with, and also help them to overcome all of their initial imposter syndrome to begin with. And once that's able to be had, I mean, looking at somebody, a professor, as distinguished and established as they are, the student will realize that it's really not necessarily not only important, but it's necessary for them to be able to provide their own perspective, just as a professor would see that they have to. And especially in situations where students may feel they have certain ideas, they have certain impressions, and the professor is involved in that conversation, there may be some times where they actually need to step back and kind of let the dialogue play out amongst the students. I know that there's a lot of dynamics and kind of a lot of structures already in place that make it difficult for students to be able to even have these types of conversations with professors. But, as was mentioned earlier, if they have office hours, if they have all these other things, that's a good opportunity for them to encourage having these conversations with students.
I'll name one of my biases here. I believe this is heart-centered work. I've experienced this work at its best when it is in tune with the body, with the emotions. And it's also hard to regulate those emotions and to listen to that body, especially many of us have been doing this very academic, head-focused work. It's what is, I believe, largely incentivized, and especially for you to get to the point of where you are in each of your careers, I can't even imagine. So I'd like to echo that that modeling. I feel that I was hearing that educator first, right? And specifically with this, a more relational approach. A relational in can be its most specific way, you know, or the most expansive way, because I don't think people, I mean, people, you all are trusting me right now. These folks here on this panel are trusting me right now. We're building relationship within a particular container. Maybe it expands past that container, maybe it doesn't, but this is trust building work. And if there's going to be some sort of follow up or follow through, when I am going to tell you, I sometimes pick the wrong questions and I make those mistakes because maybe I didn't have enough conversation partners at my same positionality and power, you know, level. Accountability partners is, I think, one partner at Deloitte had used that language. And I'm grateful for those folks who've modeled that for me and modeled the messiness and coming back from it in community.
Okay, thank you so much. I want to remind you, if you have a burning question or you want to upvote one of the questions that have already come in, you can use the QR code, because I know that we have some pretty good ones that are here. And I would say, would the person who wrote this question like to share it out loud with us? Otherwise, I'll read it. I wrote it. Okay, would you like to?
And I wasn't sure if any or all of you were at this morning's plenary. And so I was assuming not, so I wanted to give context for it. Dean Amanda Claybaugh in the college talked about the challenge that the college faces with having students come from high school backgrounds that are so heterogeneous, that some high schools that students come from are places where equity and, what she said, equity and inclusion orthodoxy that stifles discussion and debate. And she said others come from schools where students have not been allowed to talk about race or sexuality or a variety of issues. And I'm just curious, have you seen that divide? Do you feel like you are from a high school that fits into one of those? I guess this is especially for two folks in the college. Have you seen colleagues that have come from schools where they haven't been allowed to talk about these issues? Like I'd love to see into what that looks like in the landscape of the college, and how, if I'm a faculty member and I've got students coming from such divergent backgrounds, what are ways to navigate those impasses? And how do you help students to talk with each other, having come from such different places of stifling? Those are two different forms of stifling, really. So, and it could be that it's not just the college, you know, whatever this might look like at the other schools as well.
Yeah, I think on this, I would say, I would attribute this, and I didn't see the plenary. I was in Spanish class, so lo siento, I think. But I think the students, I think it is less a problem, I think, of equity, inclusion, orthodoxy, which I think it's more of an outgrowth of the nature of Harvard admissions. And I think part of Harvard admissions, and this is a good thing, is that we recruit students from everywhere. And a lot of our peers, I mean, we do have problems, you know, top 1% coming and everything like that, but a lot of our peers recruit a lot more from selective, like specialized feeder high schools or residential boarding schools and stuff like that, right? But Harvard has a much fewer numbers. So it means you're getting students from regular high schools, from regular American communities. And it means when you have that, you now have the fact that a lot of communities in America are still inherently somewhat segregated. And I think even when you have a mix of race and stuff, the high school I went to, unlike my elementary middle school, was more diverse, but it was it was next door to the university. It was a public high school next to university. So it meant the area was all university professors, students, or stuff like that. And that kind of has its own thought process. And I think the problem is when you recruit from a community high school, which most public high schools in the US are, you're recruiting from people who grew up in the same environment and are probably used to interacting with people who think a lot like them. And I think when you bring a lot of people who are used to interacting with people thinking a lot like them and put them in an environment like this, they either find and interact with the people who think a lot like them on these topics, or they don't interact on those topics at all. And I think, I don't know how you fix that, but I think maybe I would just maybe more narrowly define the problem as less a problem of equity and inclusion, more of the fact that people are just not used to having those controversial conversations at home, because you would disagree with them. You all have the exact same life path.
I would say that at least in the Kennedy School, because it's a master's institution, most of the people have seen the world and they've seen diverse places. But there is a differentiator of curiosity. Some people are more curious, and so I call them curious and furious. Uh, and and I think I have seen that separation of curious versus the furious. And I guess my struggle is always as to how to make the curious sexy without telling the furious that, hey, you're stupid. I think that should not be done. Uh, so how do we make the curious sexy, and how do we create more, bring more people into the curious spectrum is a question. But to answer it, it's very simply, yes, I've seen that separation.
I want to move on to some of the other good questions that we've gotten rolling in. And I think one thing that we're seeing from in this group is a thirst for those sort of very practical things, somewhat like the story that you told about being in class the days after October 7th. What were some of the things that happened that made things work well for a challenging conversational moment? What are some of the things perhaps you wish could have happened in a very direct way that this group of people may be in the classroom teaching, or going back and talking to the faculty who are also in the classroom teaching? So if you could get it down to some like very practical, real experience that you're conveying to the faculty, what would that be? And I think this could be a question for all of you.
I think I'm going to kind of meld the last question with this one. I think as one who's both curious and furious, depending on the context, that, and this is very div school, so please bear with me. I will get to something practical in maybe a more academic sense, but I find it to be very practical to make space for people to grieve. I found that a lot of that times that furiousness comes from, to use some restorative justice language or language of Resma Menachem, it's to metabolize that grief. And so I guess I'll use my own very practical example as a student. I think that's practical. I was born and raised in South Florida, and I worked in South Florida for a number of years. I went to college up here in the Northeast, but came back down to be with family and the like, and to fulfill certain familial expectations. For many years, I lived closeted. I'm a queer woman. I'm proud to say that now. And I only just said it last spring at my undergraduate institution at like an alumni event, which was kind of batty for me. But I still hold a lot of that anger and grief over being silenced for so long. I will acknowledge fully that there was self-silencing as well as societal silencing, both in the conservative high school that I went to, the law firm that I taught at, implicitly, the wonderful folks, in the public charter high school that I later taught at. So how is it that I tend to myself, and that answer is going to be so different for everyone, but tend to that very tender grief that is still there. For me, that goes to spiritual practice. You talked about space creation earlier. For me, I have this, for me, it's this idea of like, what brought me here was, what is secular sacred space? And how do we make those moments of meaning and to hold that grief, whether individually or collectively? So I call it this, like the stuckness that where that anger is not fueling curiosity and fueling open-hearted action, but actually stifling my ability to attempt to heal and really listen to someone else who still might very well believe that I had no place teaching in that high school classroom. So
I can chime in, and thank you for the questions so far. A very definitely digging deep. Just for context, I'll say my background to throw this in there is I came from a independent school. It's synonymous to a private school. However, I wasn't paying full tuition at the private school. I received a very generous aid package. There's a term that's sort of thrown around called privileged poor. I wouldn't say that I fit per se specifically into that category, but it's along the same lines and very similar kind of description. It was also a PWI, predominantly white institution. We actually didn't have a Black Student Association until I was in my freshman year. I got to the school when I was in 7th grade. And I was one of 2 Black people in my grade until my freshman year, which is what I guess called for a need to establish a BSA. And it was also an all-boys school, so it was single sex. And there were a lot of conversations around, masculine identity, around development, of course, topics along the lines of what defines masculine identity, or why is there a need for single sex education schools. And I think a lot of that, those are things that I bring with me into my college classrooms. Those are things that have been ingrained in me, and they also show up in other forms outside of just the college classrooms. I remember, for example, I was also playing basketball outside of school for an extracurricular. I had ambitions of getting recruited, and you know what? That didn't happen. But I'm here, so I did something. And I know that in my basketball team, we had a very starkly different environment. It was predominantly Black. All of my teammates, they used to call me, I don't even remember, I think it was like the rich white African boy or something. It was just like this whole intersection. I'm like, okay, I'll dress it on. But it's just that those experiences, I think, helps me to understand that I define who I am in different spaces. And one thing that I think is very important for Harvard faculty to acknowledge is that people can define who they are in multiple different spaces. When I was playing basketball amongst my teammates, I was the rich white African kid. But when I was in school, I wasn't given any decorated nickname or anything. I didn't have no title, but I definitely wasn't the rich white African kid, because, if anybody's calling me that there, that wouldn't make too much sense. So it's just important that who students are in different spaces shouldn't be imposed upon them. And while you might receive all these labels, or students might have this implicit impression from their faculty that I expect this from you, I expect that, it's good to have those expectations for growth and for improvement, but it is not necessarily important to expect them to be a certain way or to act a certain way, given all that they have garnered throughout high school, through college, through just life in general, because life isn't straightforward.
We have 4 minutes left, and the way that I'd like to spend the last 4 minutes is to give each of the panelists 1 minute. We ask them questions. Ashley and I ask them questions. You all pose questions. There are probably questions they wish they had that they want to tell an answer to. They want to share an insight to. So take just a few seconds. What's a question you wish that we asked that you came ready to answer and you want to share with us? And then we'll go down this way if you're ready. Okay.
The question is similar to that question, the last one up there. So whoever wrote that, thank you. But sorry we didn't get to it. But I think it's a little bit of where these conversations happens, because I think we talk a lot about the classroom, and obviously this is learning and teaching. So obviously we talk a lot about the classroom. But I think we forget there are multiple classroom spaces. There are lecture halls, there are sections, there are the spaces in between, there are seminars, there are all these different fancy terms we have for classroom that are meaningfully different. And then on top of that, for at least the college community, and I know for some of the other graduate schools, like especially the medical school, they have their dorm community, like their house community or house equivalent, their dining halls, they have all these other ways in which we share time and space. And then especially at the college, we have a huge number of student organizations that define our time, and then we have all these other various affinity and other organizations. And I think a lot of conversations cross those different things, and we saw that with recent events, as the college's favorite term is. And I think so what we consider where each conversations happen, I think is also important. And what's the space in each conversation, how conversations happen. I think that's something that's always important to be cognizant of, because the space things are happening in very, very deeply matters. And it's not always just classroom in the generic sense.
I guess if I were to phrase it as a question, I would say, what is something that you struggle with in relating to students? Or what is something that a Harvard faculty member could struggle with in relating to students? I'll say, for example, I think sometimes it's very easy to be able to form personal relationships with students, and that can make them more comfortable. But there are other students that can be much more difficult to access and can be much more reserved. And in those situations, just understanding how can you be there for a student? How can you offer the same medium in terms of a conversation, in terms of any way to relate? How can you offer the same medium to students that might be much more difficult to access? I know that just kind of one thing that I really appreciated was actually full circle moment. This was back in my freshman fall. And I had a conversation with one of my TFs about my aspirations to be an astronaut. Very naive. But I remember she was like very indulged in the conversation and very engaged with the idea. And then we eventually started talking about the moon landing and conspiracies and all this fun stuff. But I just remember what came out of that conversation was her providing a recommendation for like astronaut related movies, just things in that field. And it sticks with me ever since. I haven't been able to watch the movie, but it's just the thought that, goes behind it, and being able to relate to students in that way is more auspicious for their learning.
I think what's on my heart right now is uplifting an experience that I had for about a year and a half as a teaching assistant to Perry Doherty and Fawn Phelps at the School of Public Health. A lot of people are wondering, how the heck did that happen? You were at the Divinity School. And it was this part of the doctoral program, and it was a class on personal mastery. And the way that they treated me in community, and the way that they modeled being in community within one another as co-facilitators, and I was encouraged to be in community with the students, was transformative because of what we read, how deep we went. Some days you didn't because you didn't have as much to give, yet people were trying. So I guess my question is for myself is, what do I have left to give today in furtherance of community? Because I'm not in direct community with those folks anymore. But who am I in community with, who I could take those learnings and lessons from?
One of the questions that I frequently face is how do you measure the impact of the dialogue that you do? And because it's always so qualitative and not quantitative, and because I want to build a career in this field, this is also one of the questions that funders ask. So we've found a way to. So this was a question that I expected, and my answer is. In the dialogue circles or events that we organize, we ask students or participants on a scale of 1 to 5, how heard did you feel in this space, and how heard do you feel in HKS in general? And the swing so far has been 40%. And that I think is it gives a lot of warmth in my heart, and it gives me a lot of joy that this is a big space. This is what we can create, and that is the aim for the entire school. So, yeah. That.
I can't think of better words to end on, and I just invite you to help thank our panelists for coming today.